In 1835, the French novelist Alexandre Dumas walked through the alleys of Naples and watched something that turned his stomach. Poor families crouched over open-air stalls, eating flattened discs of dough topped with whatever scraps the day's poverty allowed. A smear of tomato, a scattering of tiny fish, sometimes nothing more than lard, garlic, and salt, and Dumas later observed that you could read a Neapolitan family's fortune in the toppings on their pizza, the way a broker reads a ticker tape. Because a bad week meant plain dough brushed with oil, a slightly better week meant tomato. And a genuinely good week might bring a few anchovies or a scrap of cheese. And Naples in the 1830s was one of the most overcrowded, most miserable cities in Europe, its population pushing past 400,000, with a large share of its residents living in what officials of the time politely called a state of destitution. And cholera would tear through the city's slums within the next 2 decades, killing thousands, and sitting right in the middle of all that suffering was a food so cheap, so scorned by the Italian upper classes that wealthy Neapolitans considered it beneath contempt, unfit for a civilized table, not gold, not spice, not silk, just flattened bread and tomato paste. A food so tied to poverty and squalor that for the better part of 3 centuries respectable Italians would not go near it. And today that same food is a roughly $150 billion global industry. Ordered from a phone and delivered to a door faster than it once took a Neapolitan laborer to walk to the market. So how did the cheapest, most looked-down-upon street food in one of Europe's poorest cities become the single most eaten dish on the entire planet? And the answer does not actually begin in Naples at all. It begins almost 6,000 years ago in the mudflats of the ancient Near East, with a discovery so basic that almost nobody thinks about it today. And that discovery is simply bread, because long before anyone had ever heard of Naples or Italy or tomatoes, human beings in the Fertile Crescent were learning to grind wild wheat and barley into paste, mix it with water, and cook it on hot stones. And archaeologists have found evidence of flatbread baking that stretches back many thousands of years in regions that today are part of Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey. And these early breads were not pizza in any recognizable sense. They were survival food, dense, cheap, and endlessly adaptable, and you could bake them on a rock, on the inside wall of a clay oven, or directly in the ashes of a fire, needing no refrigeration, no complex tools, no waiting for anything to rise, just grain, water, and heat. And in a world without granaries or supermarkets, this was not a snack. It was the difference between a family eating through the winter and a family not making it to spring. And the ancient world did not stop at plain bread for long, because in ancient Egypt, tomb paintings show flatbreads baked with herbs and oils worked into the dough. And in ancient Greece, a flat round of bread brushed with olive oil and topped with herbs, garlic, and sometimes cheese appears in the historical record. And Naples itself began life as a Greek colony, founded around the 6th century BCE, and originally named for the idea of a new city. And the Romans took the concept further still, with the statesman and writer Cato the Elder, in an agricultural manual written around 160 BCE, describing a layered flatbread called placenta, baked with cheese and honey pressed between sheets of dough. And it was not pizza, but it was close enough in concept, close enough in form, that food historians consider it a genuine ancestor. And there is also a popular legend, often repeated, that Persian soldiers under a great king baked flatbread on their shields and topped it with cheese and dates during long marches, though historians are far less confident about that one, since it shows up only in later retellings without solid ancient sourcing, and most scholars treat it as a charming story rather than a documented fact. But the fact that people keep telling it says something important, because the idea of flatbread plus topping, cooked fast and eaten on the move, was already ancient and already universal long before anyone in Naples ever touched a tomato. And here is a detail worth pausing on. The very word pizza shows up in the historical record far earlier than most people assume, with one of the earliest known written uses appearing in a Latin document from the year 997, from a town on the coast between Rome and Naples, recording a rent payment owed to a local bishop, part of which was to be paid in the form of a dozen pizzas, which means the word predates the tomato, predates Columbus, and predates the entire concept of a unified Italian nation by roughly 1,000 years. And whatever that word originally described, it almost certainly was not the tomato-topped dish people picture today. But some version of topped flatbread was already common enough in that region to be handed over as literal payment of debt, nearly a millennium before Naples ever saw a tomato plant. And none of these ancient flatbreads were reserved for kings. And that is the detail worth sitting with. Because unlike wine, which the Roman elite obsessed over with vintage-level snobbery, or spices like pepper, which cost a fortune and signaled status, flatbread was food for everyone, and Roman citizens received subsidized or free grain through a state program that at its height fed hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Rome alone. And flatbread was the delivery mechanism for that grain, cheap, filling, and about as unglamorous as food could get, feeding soldiers on campaign, dock workers, slaves, and senators alike, in different forms at different tables. And this is where the deeper pattern begins, because from the very start, thousands of years before Naples existed as we know it, flatbread topped with whatever was available was fundamentally poor people's food. It simply had not met tomatoes yet, and that meeting would take a very long time, and it would begin on an entirely different continent, because roughly 3,500 years ago, in what is now Mexico and Central America, indigenous peoples, including the Aztec and Maya, were cultivating a small wild fruit that came in colors modern shoppers would find bizarre. Some yellow, some a deep, almost bruised purple, some tiny, no bigger than a berry, and Aztec cooks used it in sauces ground with chili peppers, a combination that still forms the backbone of much of Mexican cuisine today. And for thousands of years, this plant existed entirely outside European awareness, until in the early 1500s. Spanish conquistadors arriving in the Americas encountered it, and like so many crops from the so-called New World, it made the long ocean crossing back to Europe. And here is where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn, because when tomatoes arrived in Europe in the 1520s and 1530s, almost nobody wanted to eat them, since botanists correctly identified the tomato as a member of the nightshade family, the same family that includes genuinely poisonous plants like belladonna and mandrake, and that classification alone was enough to spook an entire continent. So for decades, wealthy Europeans grew tomatoes purely as ornamental curiosities, admiring the fruit on the vine while refusing to put it anywhere near their mouths. And there is also a more specific and rather darkly comic version of the poison scare that circulated among the European aristocracy, because wealthy households of the period often ate off pewter plates, and pewter at the time contained a significant amount of lead, and tomatoes are acidic. So when an acidic fruit sat on a lead-heavy pewter plate for any length of time, it could leach out enough lead to cause poisoning, sometimes fatal poisoning, in the people who ate off that plate. And the aristocracy, eating their tomatoes on expensive pewter, sometimes did get sick or die, while the poor, eating off cheap wooden plates that leached nothing, did not. And so a genuine but completely misunderstood cause of death got blamed entirely on the tomato itself. And the fruit picked up a reputation as something dangerous that only reckless or desperate people would eat. And some German-speaking regions went even further, using a nickname for the plant tied to older folklore about poisonous nightshades. And food historians still cite this whole episode as a case study in how correlation gets mistaken for causation. And here is the detail that explains almost everything that follows. It was not scientific caution that got the tomato onto Italian tables first. It was poverty, because the very people the aristocracy looked down on, the ones eating off splintered wooden plates instead of imported pewter, were, without knowing any of the underlying chemistry, protected from the one danger the rich had actually stumbled into, and in a strange, backwards way. Being too poor to afford fashionable dinnerware may have been the single reason the tomato survived long enough in southern Italy to eventually meet a piece of flatbread at all, because the poor had nothing to lose and cheap wooden dishes to eat off of. It was the poor of southern Italy, particularly around Naples, who first began cooking with tomatoes in any serious way, and by the late 1600s and early 1700s. Agricultural records from the Kingdom of Naples show tomatoes being grown and eaten regularly among the lower classes, folded into sauces stewed with garlic and oil, and eventually spread across the flatbreads that Neapolitan street vendors had already been selling for generations. And if you think about that combination for a second, an ancient Near Eastern flatbread tradition already thousands of years old, meeting a new world, fruit the rich considered borderline poisonous. And the meeting point being the poorest neighborhoods of one of Europe's most crowded cities. That is not a glamorous origin story, but it is the true one anyway. And by the 1700s, something recognizable as modern pizza was being sold on the streets of Naples, from portable ovens and small storefronts, to dock workers, laborers, and the urban poor, collectively known at the time as the Lazzaroni, people who often lacked kitchens of their own, who worked long, physically brutal hours, and who needed food that was cheap, filling, fast, and eaten standing up or on the move. And pizza filled that need perfectly, with vendors folding it, wrapping it, and selling it by the slice for pennies, making it, in the most literal sense, fast food centuries before the term existed. And it was despised by exactly the people you would expect, because wealthy Neapolitans and the broader Italian upper class considered pizza vulgar, greasy, and a marker of low birth. And guidebooks from the period aimed at genteel travelers sometimes warned visitors away from street pizza entirely, treating it less as a regional specialty and more as a hygiene risk to be avoided. And this was not a niche opinion. It was the mainstream one, and pizza carried the stigma of poverty for well over a century, staying almost exactly where it started, in the poorest streets of a single southern city, and the turning point most commonly told. And the one that gave pizza its most famous variety involves a queen, because according to a widely repeated story from 1889, Queen Margherita of Savoy, wife of King Umberto I, visited Naples and requested to try the local street food so many of her subjects apparently loved. And a Neapolitan pizza maker is said to have prepared several pizzas for the royal visit, one of them topped simply with tomato, mozzarella, and basil, deliberately arranged to echo the red, white, and green of the newly unified Italian flag, and the queen reportedly loved it, and the pizza was named Margherita in her honor. And whether every detail of this story is historically accurate remains genuinely debated among food historians, since some point out that the tricolor combination of tomato, mozzarella, and basil likely already existed in Naples before 1889, and that the royal endorsement, if it happened at all, simply attached a memorable name and a flattering origin story to something pizza makers were already making. But here is the detail that makes the debate almost beside the point. Whether the Queen's visit unfolded exactly as the legend claims or not, the Margherita pizza did emerge from this period. It did take its name from the Queen, and it did mark one of the very first moments any part of the Italian aristocracy publicly associated itself with a dish that had spent roughly 3 centuries as food for the poor. And a single royal visit, real or embellished, cracked open a door that 300 years of stigma had kept firmly shut. And that crack would not turn into anything close to global fame from within Italy itself, though. It took an ocean crossing, a wave of desperate migration, and a period of ugly, often violent prejudice to set pizza on its path toward the rest of the world. Because between 1880 and 1920, roughly 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States, the overwhelming majority of them from the poorer regions of southern Italy, including Naples and the surrounding Campania region. And they arrived carrying almost nothing except, in many cases, the recipes and food traditions of home, and what they encountered in America was not a warm welcome, since Italian immigrants, especially those from the South, were frequently viewed by the existing American population as a different and lesser category entirely, associated in the press and in public rhetoric with crime, disease, and an inability to assimilate. And this was not merely social friction, because in March of 1891, in New Orleans, a mob killed a group of Italian immigrants following the acquittal of several men accused, without solid evidence, of murdering the city's police chief, and it remains one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. Its victims targeted specifically because they were Italian, and national newspapers at the time largely defended the killings rather than condemning them, and no one was ever prosecuted. And this was not an isolated incident either, since Italian immigrants across the country, but especially those from the South, were frequently classified on official immigration paperwork in ways that separated them from Northern Europeans, treated by the prevailing racial theories of the era as a distinct and lesser category, rather than simply as fellow Europeans. And they were crowded into some of the most overcrowded, poorly ventilated tenement housing in cities like New York and Chicago. Faced routine discrimination in hearing, and were frequently blamed in the press for crime and disease regardless of actual evidence. And pizza, and Italian food more broadly, arrived in America wrapped in exactly this climate of suspicion and hostility. So for decades it stayed almost entirely inside Italian immigrant neighborhoods, sold in small storefronts to homesick countrymen, virtually unknown and largely unwanted outside those communities. And it was not unusual for pizza to be described in mainstream American newspapers of the early 20th century as a strange, garlicky foreign curiosity, something to be regarded with amusement or suspicion rather than appetite. And this was not a footnote. This was pizza's second long stretch as an outsider's food, first scorned by Italy's own upper class, and then scorned again in a new country by people who saw the immigrants who brought it as unwelcome altogether. And the first documented licensed pizzeria in the United States opened in 1905, when a baker in Manhattan's Little Italy received a license to sell pizza from his grocery store. And for the next several decades, pizzerias like his remained essentially an ethnic curiosity, a food eaten almost exclusively by Italian Americans and viewed by much of the wider population, if they had heard of it at all, as strange, greasy, and foreign. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody in Naples, and almost nobody in America would have predicted. Because the Second World War sent hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to fight across the Italian peninsula between 1943 and 1945, stationed in and around cities like Naples. And many of these young men, most of whom had never eaten pizza in their lives, encountered it for the first time near the front lines, and they came home with a taste for it. And in the years immediately following the war, pizza consumption in the United States began climbing in a way it never had before, driven overwhelmingly by veterans who wanted to recreate something they had eaten overseas. And this is the part of pizza's history that does not get nearly enough credit. Because cultural taste alone does not turn a food into an industry, machinery does. And in the mid-1940s, an inventor developed a gas-fired pizza oven, a major improvement over the coal and wood-burning ovens that had defined Neapolitan pizza baking for 2 centuries. And that innovation made it dramatically cheaper and faster to open a pizzeria almost anywhere in the country, without needing a wood supply, a coal chimney, or years of specialized training to manage the fire. And around the same period, food scientists working with the American dairy industry developed low-moisture, part-skim mozzarella, a version of the cheese engineered specifically to melt evenly, hold up under high heat, and survive shipping and storage in a way that traditional fresh mozzarella made from water buffalo milk simply could not, since fresh mozzarella spoils within days, while the new industrial mozzarella could sit on a shelf, travel across state lines, and still perform exactly the way a pizzeria owner needed it to, and between the gas oven and the shelf-stable cheese. Pizza went from a dish that required Neapolitan-level specialization to one that a motivated entrepreneur with modest capital could replicate almost anywhere in America. And Americans took that opportunity and ran with it fast. Because in 1958, 2 brothers borrowed a small sum of money from their mother and opened a single pizza restaurant in Wichita, Kansas, that they called Pizza Hut. And 2 years later, in 1960, a young entrepreneur bought a single pizza shop in Ypsilanti, Michigan, with his brother, using a modest down payment, and that shop would eventually become Domino's Pizza. And the central insight behind that company was not about the pizza itself so much as about speed, since Domino's built its entire early business model around fast, reliable delivery, eventually promising pizza in 30 minutes or less, or the customer's money back. And that guarantee turned into a legal and public safety problem by the early 1990s, after a string of accidents involving delivery drivers speeding to meet the deadline, and the company dropped the guarantee entirely in 1993. But by then, the underlying idea, pizza as something delivered fast, directly to your door, had permanently reshaped what pizza meant in American life. And meanwhile, in home kitchens, a new category was exploding: frozen pizza. Pioneered commercially in the late 1950s by several companies, meaning that pizza no longer required a restaurant, a delivery driver, or even a working oven timer more sophisticated than the one already built into a home stove. And pizza had officially become, in the span of about 15 years, one of the cheapest, fastest, and most accessible foods in a country that had once tried to lynch the very people who brought it there. And from that point forward, the growth curve only bends upward, since American pizza chains began expanding internationally starting in the 1960s and 70s. And by the 1980s and 90s, pizza was undergoing a strange kind of re-export. The dish that started as poor Neapolitan street food, got adopted and industrialized by American chains, was now being sold back to the rest of the world. Often in forms a Neapolitan pizza maker from the 1700s would not recognize at all, since Japanese menus eventually featured toppings like corn, mayonnaise, and squid, combinations that would have baffled both the original Neapolitan street vendors and the mid-century American chain founders equally. And in Brazil, pizza became enormously popular with toppings ranging from hearts of palm to hard-boiled egg, to, in some regions, chocolate and banana on dessert pizzas. And in India, paneer and tandoori chicken pizza became standard menu items at major chains. And pizza had stopped being purely Italian, stopped being purely American, and become something closer to a universal template, a blank canvas that virtually every food culture on the planet felt free to paint over according to its own taste. And today the numbers involved are almost difficult to process, since the global pizza market is valued at roughly $150 billion annually. And in the United States, alone pizza sales account for tens of billions of dollars a year, spread across tens of thousands of pizzerias, a figure that does not even include the pizza sold through grocery stores, gas stations, and school cafeterias. And Americans are commonly estimated to eat pizza at a staggering rate every single second of every single day. And in 2017, the United Nations Cultural Agency added the traditional art of Neapolitan pizza making, the hand-spinning and wood-fired baking of pizza in Naples, to its list of intangible cultural heritage, a formal global recognition of a craft that less than 2 centuries earlier wealthy Italians would not have wanted mentioned at their own dinner table. And the United States alone is estimated to consume billions of pizzas every single year, an average that works out to a remarkable amount of pizza per person annually across the entire population. And a handful of major chains together operate tens of thousands of locations across more than 100 countries, with one of them in particular growing into one of the largest fast food companies on Earth by store count, built almost entirely on a single insight about speed that a young man in Michigan had with a few hundred borrowed dollars in 1960. But pizza is far more than just food at this point, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Because during periods of major national crisis in the United States, journalists and government watchers have, only half-jokingly, tracked pizza delivery activity around federal buildings in Washington as an informal indicator that something significant is happening behind closed doors, an idea sometimes referred to as the Pentagon Pizza Index, referenced by reporters around moments of late-night crisis meetings, on the simple logic that officials working through the night order food. And pizza is what gets ordered, and in 2001, in an entirely different kind of curveball, a major pizza chain paid to have its logo printed on a rocket, and separately arranged for a specially prepared pizza to be delivered to astronauts aboard the International Space Station, making it, by most accounts, one of the first food products delivered to space specifically as a piece of paid corporate advertising. And so a dish that started as scraps of dough and tomato sold to dock workers for pennies had, within roughly 2 centuries, become something that shows up on rockets and gets tracked as a geopolitical signal. And it was there in the mudflats of the ancient Near East as bread that kept entire communities alive through the winter. It was there in Rome feeding senators and slaves alike off the same basic recipe. It was there in Naples, scorned by the wealthy, sold for pennies to the Lazzaroni. Judged so harshly that guidebooks warned travelers away from it. It was there when a queen may or may not have tasted it and gave it a name that stuck forever. It was there when Italian immigrants carried it across an ocean into a country that met them with suspicion. And in New Orleans, with violence, it was there when American soldiers found it in the ruins of a war-torn country and could not stop thinking about it once they got home. It was there when a gas oven and a piece of engineered cheese turned a centuries-old craft into something almost anyone could replicate. and it is there right now, quite possibly sitting in a box on your kitchen counter, or waiting on an app for a driver to bring it to your door, having traveled from Mesopotamian riverbanks to Aztec fields to Neapolitan slums to a rocket bound for space, which is not bad at all for a food that upper-class Italians once considered too disgusting to put on a plate.